Some wounds don't bleed. They live in the eyes of everyone who turns away. In the winter of 1873, Caleb Dawson was the man his town left behind. Once respected, now whispered about for a moment of fear he could never take back. And as if the weight of that shame wasn't enough, the people who had turned their backs on him sent a bride to his door, a woman he'd never met, unable to walk since an accident years before. Was it a cruel joke or a chance neither of them had asked for? What would you do if the only person willing to stand beside you was someone the world had already written off? Would you turn away, or would you take that hand and face the long road together? This is a story about dignity found in unexpected places, about choosing each other when no one else would, and about the quiet kind of courage that can rebuild two broken lives into something stronger than anyone believed. If this speaks to you, I'd love for you to join our Wild West Echoes family, share, and tell us in the comments what you would have done in Caleb's boots. Now, let's step into Dry Creek, where the snow was falling sideways the day it all began. In a town where winters cut deeper than any knife, some wounds never froze over. Caleb Dawson carried one such wound branded into him the night he failed to stand. It was December of 1873 in Dry Creek, Wyoming. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight, laying a heavy quilt over the rooftops and clogging the narrow dirt streets. Folks moved slower in weather like this, heads bent into the wind, breath turning to steam in the air. But some things moved quick, no matter the season like talk. In Dry Creek, talk traveled faster than a snowstorm, and once it stuck to a man, it stayed. 2 years back. Caleb had been the kind of man other men nodded to in the street, the one folks called when there was trouble on the range. But that was before the night on the Union Pacific freight train, when a gang of masked riders brought the Iron Horse to a screeching halt. Guns barked in the dark, the whistle shrieked like it was in pain, and somewhere in the chaos, Caleb made a choice, or failed to. The story went that he'd hidden himself inside a cargo car while his partner, Eli Turner, fought alone. By the time the dust settled, Eli was gone, and so was Caleb's good name. Whether the tale was true or not didn't seem to matter. In a place like Dry Creek, truth bent easy under the weight of a good rumor. That evening, Caleb pushed open the door to Murphy's saloon, the old hinges groaning like they'd rather not let him in. The air inside was warm and thick with pipe smoke, the kind that clung to your clothes long after you left. Men were scattered along the bar and at card tables, shoulders hunched, hats low, mugs steaming. A few looked up when he entered, and their eyes slid away again as quick as river ice breaking. He kept his coat on, not because of the cold, but because the chill here wasn't in the air. It was in the silence that settled when he stepped across the threshold. He walked to the far end of the bar, nodding once to Murphy. The barkeep's return nod was stiff, polite the way you might be to a stranger you didn't trust yet. From the card table nearest the stove came a voice, sharp enough to slice through the quiet. "Well, if it ain't Dry Creek's own hero," someone drawled, and the word hero was bent so far it near broke. Caleb didn't answer, just kept his eyes on the glass. Murphy sat in front of him. Another voice chimed in, heavier, with a slur of whiskey in it. "You hear the latest? Dawson, heard you're getting hitched. Whole town's talking." A ripple of laughter followed, the low, mean kind. Caleb's jaw worked once, but he stayed silent. "Oh, don't play dumb," the first man said, leaning back in his chair so the stove's glow lit the smirk on his face. "It's perfect. Really. They found you a bride who can't run neither." That brought more laughter, and even Murphy's eyes flickered with something between pity and discomfort. Someone else at the table spoke up. Margaret Hayes. Remember her used to teach the schoolhouse before that wagon tipped on her 2 winters back. Pretty thing, till the accident. Now she don't walk at all. The name landed heavier than the rest of their words. Caleb remembered Margaret Hayes in a vague way, her red hair catching sunlight in the schoolyard, her voice carrying over the laughter of children. He'd seen her at church socials, standing straight-backed in a blue dress. He hadn't seen her since the accident. The man went on. Her folks are itching to marry her off. Get her out from underfoot.
And you, Dawson? Well, you ain't exactly in high demand these days. Are you 2 folks with no place else to go? He grinned. That's a match made right here in Dry Creek. Caleb could feel every pair of eyes on him, waiting to see if he'd snap or hang his head, or maybe just walk out. He finished his drink in one swallow, set the glass down slow enough to keep his hand steady. No words came to him that wouldn't sound like begging or breaking. So he said nothing at all. The laughter was still echoing when he turned for the door. The cold hit him like a slap the moment he stepped outside. Snow crunched under his boots, the wind knifing through his coat, tugging at his hat brim. Out here, under the pale wash of lamplight on the street, the air was cleaner but no less sharp. He pulled his collar high and started the long walk back to his place at Red Rock. The sound of their voices stayed with him, riding the wind all the way out of town. He didn't know yet if this talk of a bride was just another cruel jest or something more dangerous. But as the snow swirled and the wind bit deep, one thing was certain, whatever it was coming for him, and soon. The snow was falling sideways when the wagon came. Carrying more than just a stranger, it carried the weight of 2 ruined reputations. By mid-afternoon, the wind had shifted to a steady push from the north, scattering dry flakes across the open prairie like spilled flour. Caleb had been stacking firewood along the lee side of the barn when he spotted the wagon cresting the hill. Its canvas bowed under the wind's shove. 2 mules pulled slow through the drifts, their flanks dusted white. Behind them, the driver hunched into his coat, one hand gripping the reins, the other shielding his face from the sting of the snow. Caleb knew who it was before the wheels even reached the yard. Word traveled too quick in Dry Creek for him not to. This would be the day they sent her, the woman the saloon had laughed about, the one they thought matched him in misfortune. The wagon groaned to a stop a few paces from his porch. The driver climbed down, boots crunching in the packed snow. "Dawson," he called, his voice carrying through the cold. Caleb nodded. "That's me. Got your bride," the man said without ceremony, jerking his thumb toward the back of the wagon. He might as well have been talking about a barrel of grain. Caleb felt his jaw tighten, but said nothing. He walked to the tailgate as the driver untied the ropes and pulled the canvas aside. There she was, Margaret Hayes. She lay propped on a cushion, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, red hair spilling in loose waves over her shoulders. Her skin was pale from the cold, but her green eyes were steady, sharp, and far from fragile. They met his without flinching, and for a moment, the wind and the snow fell away. "You must be Caleb Dawson," she said. Her voice was calm, low, and sure like a teacher taking roll on the first day of class. "That's right," he answered. "They told you I can't walk." "They did," he said, shifting his weight, "and you still agreed to this." The question hung there, sharp and bare. No ice in her tone, just an unvarnished demand for truth. Caleb hesitated, knowing any answer he gave might set the tone for every day that followed. "I reckon I did," he said finally. She gave the faintest nod, as if filing the answer away for later. "Then, let's get this done." The driver helped lift her from the wagon, his hands under her arms. She moved with practiced care, guiding her own weight. Caleb stood ready,
but she didn't look to him for balance. Her wheelchair followed a well-made piece of work, sturdy oak frame with brass fittings polished by use, the sort of thing bought with love and regret in equal measure. The three of them made their way to the porch. The snow creaked underfoot, and the cold seemed to press closer. Caleb held the door open, and Margaret wheeled herself inside without waiting for invitation. The cabin's interior was dim in the late daylight. A small fire in the stove threw shadows across the plank walls. Caleb noticed her eyes moving quickly, taking in the cramped layout, the narrow doorways, the high counters, the uneven floorboards. "It's compact," she said, not unkindly, but with a note that told him she'd already catalogued every challenge the place would give her. He took her coat and hung it by the door. "It's kept me warm," he said simply. Margaret settled in the middle of the room, her hands resting lightly on the wheels. "I'm not here to be anyone's pity project. Mr. Dawson, if that's what you agreed to, you can save us both the trouble now." Caleb met her gaze. There was no malice in it, only a quiet resolve, the kind forged by having to learn new ways to live. "That's not what this is," he said, though the words felt thin in the air between them. "Good," she replied, and looked away. The conversation closed on her terms. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Caleb glanced toward the window, then back at her. It struck him that they were both here because someone else decided they should be two lives intersecting not by choice, but by circumstance. Firewood stacked high. He offered, "If the weather turns, we'll be fine for heat." Margaret gave a small nod. "I'll manage inside." He believed her, but as he moved to stir the fire, he couldn't shake the thought that heat was the least of what this house would need in the days ahead. The sun was sinking when the driver tipped his hat and left, the crunch of his boots fading into the hiss of the falling snow. Caleb closed the door behind him, sealing the cabin against the cold. For a moment, they stood in the same room yet apart, the silence stretching like a drift between them. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the faint hum of the wind through the eaves. Caleb knew winter had a way of making distances feel longer. And in this house, tonight, the miles weren't measured in steps or wheels, they were measured in trust, and that kind of road was never quick to cross. He moved to put another log on the fire, wondering which would take longer this winter, waiting for the snow to melt, or for Margaret Hayes to decide whether she could stand the man she'd been sent to live with. A house can be warm and still feel colder than the wind outside, especially when it wasn't built for two. The first mornings passed in a quiet that wasn't peace. Margaret rose early, her chair whispering over the plank floor as she made her way from one corner of the cabin to another. Caleb kept to his own rhythms, feeding the fire, tending the horses, checking the trap lines, but he noticed the way she moved through the rooms. The house had been built for a single man who didn't mind bumping his hip on a counter or squeezing sideways through a doorway with an armload of wood. The narrow thresholds caught her wheels more often than not. The kitchen table sat just far enough from the stove to make carrying a pot awkward. The shelves were high, and the only way to reach the flour bin was to stretch until her shoulders trembled. She didn't ask for help, not once. One afternoon, Caleb came in from splitting logs to find her half-turned in the kitchen, struggling to lift the coffee tin from the shelf. Her hand slipped, and the tin clattered down, spilling dark grounds across the counter like dried river silt. "I'll get that," he said. "I can do it," she replied, already reaching for a rag. So he stepped back, leaning against the doorframe, watching as she swept the mess into her palm and dropped it into the stove box. She moved on to the next task without a word. It went that way for days, small battles fought in silence, a drawer that stuck, a door latch stiff with cold, a kettle that sat too far back on the stove. She tackled each one, sometimes winning, sometimes leaving it for later, but always without complaint. Caleb told himself it wasn't his place to interfere unless she asked. Folks didn't like feeling managed, and he figured Margaret was no different. But the truth was, he didn't quite know how to bridge the space between offering help and making her feel small. That space felt as real as the one between the table and the stove, just a few steps, but enough to stop a person cold. Then came the afternoon of the kettle. The sky was the flat gray of a snow-heavy day, and the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters. Caleb sat at the table mending a saddle strap when he heard the scrape of chair wheels in the kitchen. Margaret was trying to move a kettle from the stove to the table, bracing one hand on her wheel rim while balancing the pot in the other. Steam curled upward, and the handle wobbled in her grip. He rose, but she didn't see him. The kettle tilted, sloshing hot water over the rim. A hiss rose as it splattered onto the stove's iron surface, missing her arm by inches. Caleb was beside her in 2 strides, his hand closing over the kettle handle. "Careful," he said, setting it down safe. For a moment she just looked at him, her jaw tight, the steam still drifting between them. "I had it," she said finally. "Nearly didn't," he replied, softer than he'd meant. She turned away, reaching for a cup. "I can figure it out." He nodded, though his mind was already elsewhere. That evening, as she read by lamplight in the chair by the stove, Caleb sat on the porch steps with the cold seeping through his coat, looking out over the yard. The snow had crusted hard, the barn casting a long shadow toward the fence line. He thought about the doorways that caught her wheels, the shelves out of reach, the narrow space between table and stove. He thought about the coffee tin on the floor, the kettle's near spill. The cabin had been enough for him, but it wasn't enough for them. When the wind shifted and the night deepened, he went inside, banking the fire low. Margaret glanced up from her book, but didn't speak. He hung his coat, washed his hands, and let the thought settle in his mind until it felt like a decision. By morning, the air was bright with the sharp scent of fresh-cut pine. Margaret, still in her robe, wheeled into the main room to find Caleb out on the porch, saw in hand a neat stack of boards already forming beside him. The rhythmic rasp of the blade carried through the cold like a promise. Margaret watched him through the frosted window pane, the sound of sawing steady as the heartbeat of the house. She didn't know yet what he was building, but she suspected it had less to do with wood and more to do with the distance between them. Some men rebuild barns. Caleb rebuilt a home one plank, one hinge, one quiet act at a time. It began the morning after the kettle incident. The sun had barely cleared the ridge when the sound of sawing and the thump of a hammer echoed through the yard. Caleb worked with his coat collar turned up, breath puffing white in the cold. Boards laid out across 2 sawhorses like a plane only he could see. By midday, a ramp took shape over the porch steps, sturdy, wide, the planks smoothed so they wouldn't catch a wheel. Margaret wheeled to the doorway, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and watched as he set the last nail. He didn't glance up, didn't explain. When he finished, he stepped aside, nodding toward the ramp. She tried it without a word, rolling down into the yard and back up again. The boards held firm. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before retreating inside. The next day, he lowered the kitchen shelves. He moved the flour bin to the counter and hung a ladle on a hook where she could reach it. When she passed through, her hand brushed over the new arrangement, testing the height, the feel. By week's end, the narrow bathroom doorway had been widened. Caleb had removed the old frame, planed the edges, and set the hinges back just enough to give her wheels a clean pass. Sawdust clung to his sleeves as he worked, the scent of pine and oak mingling with the aroma of coffee from the stove. Margaret noticed every change, but she didn't speak of them. Instead, she simply used what he'd altered: the ramp in the morning, the lowered shelves when she cooked, the widened doorway when she rolled in to wash up. Her silence wasn't cold, it was measured, as if she were giving the changes time to settle before acknowledging them. Caleb didn't press for thanks. For him, the work was its own answer to questions they hadn't yet learned how to ask each other. Still, there were moments when their eyes met across the room, her gaze lingering a second longer than before, his hands pausing in their work. The cabin felt less like a set of tight corners and more like a space that could hold two lives without either having to shrink. One evening, as he planed the edge of a door in the glow of lamplight, Margaret wheeled to the threshold. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice steady but softer than he'd heard it before. He looked up from his work, the shavings curling at his feet. "So you can move around better?" "You don't owe me this," she said. "I know." She studied him for a moment. Then why he met her eyes. "Because it's our home now." Something shifted in the air then, not loud or sudden, but real. Her hands rested loosely on the wheels, and she gave a single, slow nod before turning away. He watched her go, the sound of her chair fading down the widened hall. That night, the wind picked up. Snow dusted against the windows, and the shutters rattled in their frames. Caleb stoked the fire higher, listening to the low whistle through the eaves. He knew winter storms could roll in quick on the plains, but this wind had a different tone, like it carried more than snow in its wake. Near midnight, a sudden gust slammed against the front door, hard enough to shake the hinges. Margaret startled awake in the chair by the stove. Caleb crossed the room in 2 strides, pressing a hand to the latch. The wind howled again, rattling the door in its frame, then faded into a low moan around the cabin. They exchanged a glance, neither speaking. Outside, the cold was moving in fast, and with it, something else neither of them could yet name. Caleb stood with his hand still on the latch, feeling the pulse of the wind against the wood. In that moment, he knew the quiet days might be ending, and whatever was coming would test more than the walls he'd rebuilt. The wind carried more than snow that night, it carried trouble on horseback. It was near midnight when Caleb heard it, the faint rhythm of hooves muffled by the snow, steady and deliberate. He had been mending a strap by the fire, the quiet broken only by the hiss of the kettle and the occasional pop from the stove. But this sound didn't belong to the night it was moving toward them. He set the strap aside and stood, his shadow stretching long across the floor. Margaret was reading by lamplight, the glow catching the copper strands in her hair. She looked up, her eyes narrowing as the sound drew closer. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, carrying the muffled snort of horses and the creak of saddles. Caleb moved to the window, easing the curtain aside just enough to see 3 riders breaking through the white swirl. They came without haste, their shapes growing sharper with each step toward the porch. "They're stopping here," Caleb said quietly. Margaret set her book down. "Friends of yours?" "Not likely," he replied. The knock came, heavy and flat against the wood, 3 blows spaced just far enough apart to let the silence in between sink deep. Caleb reached beneath the side table and pulled out the rifle, keeping it low, the barrel pointed toward the floor. "Stay back," he told her. But Margaret wheeled forward instead, her expression calm, deliberate. She reached under the seat cushion of her chair and drew out a Colt revolver, the blued steel worn smooth at the grip. Caleb recognized it for what it was, a weapon kept close not for show but for need. The door shook as the latch gave way under a rough shove. Cold air burst in, carrying the scent of wet leather and horse. The man in front was tall, shoulders filling the doorway, his coat dark with snowmelt. Behind him, two others stepped in, boots leaving heavy prints on the plank floor. "Well now," the tall one drawled, scanning the room. "Didn't think you'd be so quick to open up for company." "Dawson." Caleb stayed steady, rifle angled but not raised. "What do you want payment?" the man said, brushing snow from his sleeve. "Call it a toll for living quiet out here, and maybe for keeping certain stories about you from spreading further." The words carried more bite than the wind. Margaret's gaze flicked to Caleb, but she said nothing. "You think you can buy silence?" Caleb asked. The man's smile was thin. "Not buy, rent, and the price goes up if you don't pay on time." One of the others shifted his stance, edging toward Margaret's side of the room. She didn't flinch. Instead, she lifted the Colt, thumb resting lightly on the hammer. The sound of the metal clicking back cut clean through the moment. "Best keep your distance," she said evenly. The man near her froze, his eyes dropping to the barrel pointed just shy of his chest. The tall one chuckled low. "Your lady's got grit. Dawson, shame grit doesn't stop bullets." Before Caleb could answer, the second rider moved fast, lunging forward. Caleb pivoted, stepping into his path. His free hand shot out, catching the man by the coat and sending him off balance into the wall. The thud echoed through the small cabin. Margaret didn't wait for what might come next. She fired a single round into the ceiling, the crack exploding in the tight space, showering a few flakes of plaster. The sound rolled over them, loud enough to make the horses outside whinny in alarm. Silence followed thick, ringing silence. The tall man's smirk faltered. He took a step back, eyes moving between the rifle in Caleb's hands and the Colt steady in Margaret's grip. Whatever he'd expected to find here, it wasn't this. "Let's go," he muttered to the others. They backed toward the open door, the wind clawing at their coats. Outside, the snow swirled harder, swallowing their shapes as they mounted up and rode off into the dark. The sound of hoofbeats faded until it was just the wind again. Caleb closed the door, sliding the bolt into place. The cabin was suddenly too quiet, the air still holding the echo of the shot. He turned to Margaret. She was lowering the Colt, her hands steady, her expression unreadable. For a long moment they just looked at each other, the fire casting their shadows against the wall. It struck him then not just that they'd faced trouble together, but how easily they'd fallen into step. No planning, no orders, just instinct, side by side, outside. The snow kept falling, inside. The fire popped, and the two of them sat in the quiet, both knowing without saying it whatever else the winter brought. They weren't standing alone anymore. Freedom isn't always a place. It's a height you thought you'd never reach again. For weeks after the night of the riders, Caleb kept himself busy in the barn long after his other chores were done. He claimed he was patching tack or fixing the loft rail, but his hammer rang at odd hours, and Margaret sometimes heard the creak of rope or the low groan of pulleys. He never said what he was working on, and she didn't ask, not out of disinterest, but because she could see the quiet purpose in his shoulders when he walked back from the barn, sawdust in his hair and that faint look of someone shaping an idea with his hands. Snow lay deep on the prairie now, a clean white sheet over the rolling land. Nights came early and lasted long. One such night, with the moon bright enough to paint shadows across the drifts, Caleb stepped into the cabin and said, "Come with me." Margaret looked up from her sewing. "It's near midnight." "You'll see," he said, his mouth curving into something between a smile and a secret. She let him wrap her in her thickest coat and a wool blanket. The cold bit her cheeks as he wheeled her toward the barn, their breath mingling in the air. Inside, the lantern light revealed a contraption suspended from the rafters, a web of leather straps. padded harness and sturdy rope threaded through a system of pulleys anchored to the beams. "What is this?" she asked, her voice caught between suspicion and wonder. "Something I built for you," Caleb said, adjusting the harness. "So you can ride Shadow," she blinked, "on a horse." He nodded. "It's been too long since you've seen the world from up there." Margaret's throat tightened. She hadn't been in a saddle since the accident, hadn't even let herself imagine it. The ground had become her horizon, and she'd learned to make do with it. Now, the thought of rising above it again made her pulse quicken. Slowly, Caleb helped her into the harness, his hands sure but gentle. "I've got you," he murmured each time the straps shifted. When the pulleys took her weight, she gasped, half fear, half exhilaration, as the chair dropped away beneath her. Shadow stood waiting, his breath steaming in the cold. Caleb guided the rig forward until she hovered above the saddle. Then, with the slow release of the rope, she settled into place, the leather creaking under her. For a heartbeat she held herself rigid, but then her body remembered the rhythm, the feel of a living creature moving beneath her. The barn doors stood open to the night. Beyond them, the snowfield shimmered silver under the moon, every fence post casting a long shadow, every drift catching the light. Caleb mounted behind her, tucking the blanket around them both. He leaned close, his voice warm against the chill. "The world might have taken your legs, but it will never take your horizon." Something in her chest broke open at those words, not from pain, but from the sudden rush of knowing he meant them. She let out a breath that was half a laugh, half a sob. They rode slowly out into the open. The only sounds were the soft crunch of hooves in snow and the creak of the saddle. From here, the prairie rolled away in every direction, endless and still. The stars seemed close enough to touch, and the moon poured its light over the land like spilled milk. For the first time in 3 years, Margaret felt taller than the fences, taller than the weight she'd been carrying. She felt herself part of the vast sweep of land instead of a watcher at its edge. She didn't speak. Neither did Caleb. Words would have been too small for the moment. They turned back only when the cold began to press in. In the barn, he lifted her from the saddle with the same care he'd used to place her there, lowering her into her chair. Her hands lingered on the blanket in her lap, the leather scent of the harness still in her breath. As Caleb coiled the ropes, she watched him, the lines of his face softened by lantern light. She realized then that he wasn't just fixing fences and patching roofs anymore. He was building something larger, and maybe she could, too. When they stepped back into the cabin, the warmth of the stove wrapped around them. Margaret glanced at Caleb and thought, if he can build me a way to ride again, perhaps there's a way for both of us to start over entirely. Some offers come dressed as kindness, but carry the weight of goodbye. The morning was bright but brittle, the kind where sunlight sharpens the edges of the snow instead of softening them. Caleb had gone into town for supplies, leaving Margaret to tend the stove and make a batch of biscuits. She liked mornings alone. Sometimes it gave her space to measure her new routines without feeling watched. When he returned, he laid a small bundle on the table: flour, coffee, and a single envelope sealed in pale blue wax. "This came for you," he said, nodding toward it. "From back east. Postmark says Pennsylvania." Margaret's hands paused over the mixing bowl. Only one person from home wrote to her anymore, her cousin Daniel. She wiped her fingers and took the envelope, the paper cool against her skin. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she set it beside her plate at dinner, letting it sit there like a guest neither of them had invited but couldn't ignore. Caleb didn't press. He just sipped his coffee and waited. After the dishes were washed, she broke the seal. Daniel's handwriting was as neat and careful as she remembered. He wrote about the store her father once owned, now in other hands. The current owner was looking to sell. Daniel offered to help her buy it back if she came home. He had even arranged a way for her to settle with Caleb, sell her share of the mercantile here. Take the money and start fresh. The words were wrapped in warmth. He missed her, wanted her close to family again, but beneath them, she felt the pull of another current. Going back would mean leaving Caleb. It would mean trading this hard, uncertain life for something steadier and something smaller. She folded the letter and set it down. He says, I could have the store again, in Harrisburg. Caleb's eyes flicked to the folded paper. That's a good offer. It is. She hesitated, then added, he thinks I should sell my part of this place to you, take the money, and start over. The room went quiet except for the faint tick of the stove cooling. Would you? He asked. I don't know, she said, and it was the truth. It would be easier, safer, but... She glanced toward the window, where the snow was catching the moonlight on the drift by the fence. I'd be walking away from something, too, even if I can't walk. Caleb leaned back in his chair, rubbing his thumb along the grain of the table. I can't tell you what to do. That's not what I'm asking. She looked at him now, steady and unblinking. I need to know if I'm here because you want me here, or because you feel you owe me something. His jaw tightened. It's not about owing. Then what is it if I could walk again? If my name wasn't a burden, would you still want me here? He shut his eyes for a moment, the question pressing against places in him he'd avoided. The kettle on the stove hissed softly, and the horses outside stamped in the cold. I don't know, he admitted at last. I don't know what I'd have done in some other life. Margaret's gaze sharpened. Then, why are you here in this one? He let out a slow breath. Because in this one, I don't want to run from you. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever. Something in her eased at that. Not everything, but enough to feel the warmth of the fire again. She picked up the letter and slipped it back into its envelope. I'm not answering him yet, she said. Caleb nodded once, as if that was enough for now. They sat in the lamplight, the wind moving around the cabin's corners. Outside, the snow still covered the world in white. Inside, the letter lay on the table between them, heavy with its promise and its price. Margaret wheeled to her room later that night with the letter in her lap, knowing she hadn't decided but feeling deep down that her choice was already leaning toward the man who'd said he wouldn't run. In Dry Creek, a store wasn't just a place to trade, it was a place to belong. The old mercantile had stood on Main Street since before the war, its clapboard siding weathered to the color of driftwood, its windows clouded from years of dust and neglect. Margaret's father had once kept them so clean you could see your reflection from the boardwalk. Now, as she wheeled past, she could see only faint shadows moving inside Caleb, sweeping the floorboards, and the warm glow of the stove he'd lit that morning. They'd spent the past week bringing the place back to life. Shelves had been scrubbed and restocked with barrels of flour, sacks of beans, bolts of cloth. Caleb had mended the old coffee grinder until it turned smooth again. Margaret arranged jars of hard candy in the front display, the colors catching what little winter light came through the windows. On opening morning, frost still edged the porch railings, but the bell over the door rang before the sign had even been hung straight. Mrs. Harper from the livery stepped in first, stamping snow from her boots, her eyes roaming over the shelves. Looks better than I remember, she said, her voice carrying the faint surprise of someone expecting less. Margaret thanked her and offered a steaming cup of coffee from the pot Caleb had set near the stove. The smell drifted through the room, warm and inviting, pulling in more townsfolk as the morning wore on. By midday, the mercantile was alive again. Men leaned against the counter discussing the coming spring planting. Women browsed the bolts of calico while children pressed their noses to the candy jars. The scrape of chairs, the clink of coins, and the low hum of conversation filled the space that had been silent for too long. Margaret moved easily among the customers, answering questions, weighing out sugar, measuring cloth. Caleb handled the heavier work-lifting crates, carrying grain to the wagons outside, but every so often, their eyes would meet across the room, and there'd be that quiet acknowledgement they were building something together. Not everyone was quick to smile. A few of the old-timers still looked at Caleb like they were remembering a story they preferred to believe. But even those men lingered a little longer than they meant to, their words softening when Margaret handed them their change with a nod. By the end of the week, the store had become more than a place to buy goods. It was a place where folks lingered just to talk, to warm themselves before heading back into the wind. Margaret could see it in their faces. Curiosity was slowly giving way to something like respect, but respect in Dry Creek could be as fragile as thin ice. It was late on a Wednesday afternoon when Caleb came in from unloading supplies with a look that didn't match the day's small successes. He set the crate down gently and said, "Heard talk in town." Margaret glanced up from her ledger. "What kind of talk Buck Harlan's been asking about us?" "About the store." The name was enough to make her still her pen. She'd heard of Harlan, a man who treated other people's hard work like something to take, not admire. If he was interested, it wasn't to buy a bolt of cloth. Caleb didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. But that evening, as they locked the door and the street outside fell quiet, the shadow of his words lingered. 2 days later, the sound of hoofbeats broke the soft rhythm of a winter morning. Margaret was at the counter, pouring coffee for Mrs. Harper, when she saw a shape move past the window, a rider slowing to a stop out front. The sunlight flashed off the metal of his stirrup as he swung down. She didn't need to ask Caleb who it was. The bell over the door hadn't even finished ringing when the man stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. Caleb straightened behind the counter, the air between them already tightening. Sometimes the fight isn't to win, it's to make sure they never see you as prey again. The morning had been slow, the kind where the cold kept folks by their stoves. Margaret was sorting sacks of flour when the sound came hoofbeats, more than one horse, moving together in a way that spoke of intent. Caleb felt it before he saw them, the rhythm too heavy for casual riders. Through the frost-blurred glass, he counted 6 men. Buck Harlan led them, his dark coat snapping in the wind, his mouth curled in that half-smile that never reached his eyes. They dismounted with the easy swagger of men who thought the world belonged to them. The bell over the door jangled hard as Buck pushed it open. He took his time brushing snow from his shoulders, letting the cold seep in behind him. "Morning, Dawson," he drawled. "Fine place you've got here." Caleb kept his hands on the counter, his stance calm but anchored. "What do you want?" "Buck just making a friendly call. See, me and my boys, we keep things running smooth around Dry Creek, roads safe, wagons untouched. That kind of thing costs money. Figure you'd like to chip in? Call it a protection fee." Margaret rolled out from behind the counter, her chair as steady as any man's legs. "And if we don't?" she asked, her voice even. Buck's gaze slid to her, lingering too long. "Well now, that'd be a shame. Accidents happen. Windows break. Stock goes missing. Wouldn't want to see that, would we?" A couple of townsfolk had drifted in behind the men, drawn by curiosity. They stayed near the door, watching. No one spoke. Caleb's jaw flexed. "This store's ours. We're not paying you a dime." Buck took a slow step forward, closing the space between them.
"You sure about that?" Margaret's hand moved almost lazily toward the Colt resting on her lap, the one her father had given her. Before Buck could register it, she cocked the hammer and fired. The bullet slammed into the floorboards an inch from his boot, the sound snapping through the room like lightning. Dust and splinters rose where the lead hit. Every man in the place froze. "I miss by choice," she said, her voice steady, carrying over the ringing silence. "Try me again, and I won't." Buck's smile faltered, his eyes flicking to Caleb, who now held his rifle level, the barrel dark and certain. "This is your warning," Caleb said, his voice low but carrying. "You don't take from us. You don't threaten us, not anymore." For a moment, no one moved. Then one of Buck's men shifted, testing the air, but the weight of the room had changed. The eyes on them weren't fearful anymore, they were sharp, measuring. Buck stepped back, the heel of his boot crunching over the splintered wood. "You're both insane," he muttered. "No," Margaret said, her gaze never leaving his. "We're just done being prey." Something in her tone closed the conversation better than any rifle shot could. Buck jerked his head toward the door, and his men followed, their boots heavy on the boardwalk outside. The hoofbeats faded into the winter air. Inside, the mercantile was silent except for the slow exhale Caleb hadn't realized he was holding. He looked at Margaret, the smell of gunpowder still between them. She was calm, the Colt resting in her lap as if it had always belonged there. In that moment, Caleb saw her not as someone the town had cast aside, but as the partner he wanted beside him, strong, unflinching, and his equal in every fight worth having. The townsfolk slipped out without a word, but Caleb knew they'd carry this story. And for once, he didn't mind. Some vows are spoken under the open sky, where nothing stands between you and forever. The days after the standoff brought a different kind of winter to Dry Creek. Folks who'd once crossed the street to avoid Caleb now lingered on the boardwalk outside the mercantile, tipping their hats when they passed. A few even came in just to talk with Margaret, pretending they needed coffee or flour. Word of Buck Harlan's retreat had traveled fast and grown in the telling. Some said Caleb had run him out with a single look. Others swore Margaret had shot the hat clean off his head. Neither of them bothered to correct it. Life settled into a steady rhythm. Mornings smelled of fresh bread and ground coffee. Afternoons hummed with conversation and the scrape of chairs. Caleb kept the fire stoked in the potbelly stove, and Margaret kept the books with a hand as steady as any man who'd run a store for decades. One evening, after the last customer left and the snow outside had turned to soft flurries, Caleb stood by the counter, watching her close the ledger. He'd been carrying a small leather pouch in his pocket for days, feeling its weight as if it were a question. "Belle," he said softly, the name he'd never used unless the moment mattered. She looked up, the lamplight catching the copper strands in her hair. "What is it?" He came around the counter, his boots quiet on the worn planks. "I've been thinking about how this started. You came here in a wagon like a parcel nobody wanted, and I was so low I thought maybe I deserved a life built on someone else's charity. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being that." Her eyes softened, but she didn't speak. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the pouch. From it, he drew a silver ring, simple but strong, etched with a hawk in flight and a sprig of wild sage. "I don't want you here because you need me," he said, voice steady. "I want you here because I can't imagine a day without you in it. Not because we have to, but because we choose to." Margaret's lips trembled into a smile. "You fool," she whispered, tears bright in her eyes. "You wonderful fool." 2 weeks later, they married under a sky so clear it seemed carved from glass.
The ceremony was small, just a handful of townsfolk, Reverend Ellis from up near the foothills, and the wind carrying the smell of sagebrush across the open field. Margaret wore a deep blue dress that had once belonged to her mother, and Caleb wore his cleanest shirt with a vest she'd mended herself. They spoke their vows without paper. Caleb promised to never hide from who he was again, because she had made him believe he was worth standing for. Margaret vowed to stand beside him, even if she could not stand at all. There was no music, only the sound of the prairie and the rustle of dresses in the breeze. When Reverend Ellis told him to kiss the bride, Caleb knelt so that he could meet her there, eye to eye. The kiss was simple, but it held the weight of every mile they'd walked together, from the cold silence of their first meeting to this warm, boundless moment. After the guests drifted away, they went back to the mercantile. On the porch lay a new sign they'd built together. Caleb lifted it into place above the door while Margaret steadied the ladder. The letters, carved deep and painted dark, read, "Margaret and Caleb's Mercantile. Goods for the strong and the free." It wasn't just a name. It was a statement, a quiet declaration that what they had built together belonged to no one else and could not be taken. Caleb came down from the ladder and stood behind her chair. The afternoon sun was low, turning the snow in the street to gold. He rested his hands on her shoulders, then gently pushed her out onto the boardwalk. "What are you doing?" she asked, laughing as the wheels bumped over the threshold. "Giving you a view," he said. She looked out at Dry Creek, at the street they'd both walked down with their heads low, at the people who now waved from across the way, at the horizon that had once felt too far. The sun touched her face, and for a moment there was no past, no shame, just the warmth of now. Caleb looked down at her and smiled, knowing this wasn't the end of their story, but it was the beginning of the one that mattered. Not a life born from necessity, but from choice. In a town where winters cut deep, they had found a season of their own making, built on dignity, freedom, and a love that neither pity nor scorn could touch. And under that wide Wyoming sky, they belonged. In the quiet sweep of the Wyoming plains, Caleb and Margaret's story reminds us that worth is never defined by the whispers of others. Both carried scars, his born from a moment of fear, hers from a cruel twist of fate. The world had decided who they were: broken, diminished, unworthy. But the world was wrong. Their journey was not about grand victories, but about the small, steady choices that built trust, lowering a shelf, braving a winter's night, standing firm against those who would take what wasn't theirs. In time, they discovered that dignity is not given, it is claimed, and love is strongest when it's a choice, not an obligation. For those of us who have seen more winters than springs, this truth is worth holding close. It is never too late to stand for yourself, to reach for another hand, and to build something lasting from the pieces others overlooked. Our value is not in what we've lost, but in what we choose to keep: faith, courage, and the will to see each other as whole. Because in the end, freedom isn't just a place. It's the life you choose to live together. Thank you for riding along with us through this story from the heart of the Old West. If Caleb and Margaret's journey spoke to you, if it stirred a memory, a smile, or a bit of hope, please give this video a like, share it with someone who'd cherish it, and subscribe to Wild West Echoes for more tales of grit, love, and redemption. Your support keeps these stories alive and helps them reach others who believe, like we do, that no soul is ever truly forgotten.